Dr. Matthias Evers. Dr. Evers is a principal at McKinsey and Company. Dr. Evers holds a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Bochum. After a postdoc in Hamburg, he joined McKinsey and Company. He has worked with pharmaceutical clients in the EU, US, Asia, on overcoming innovation challenges in the early and late-stage clinical, medical, and commercialization spaces. He is also engaged in cross-industry dialogue on drug innovation through the McKinsey Medical Affairs Forum, which he co-founded. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Matthias Evers and his esteemed panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you and good morning. It's certainly a pleasure to be here on such a nice day in Cambridge. And I think I say that on behalf of the entire panel here. We will welcome you to the second panel today, which is about the funding gap. So we will speak about, a bit about the challenge of funding what is ever more complicated, more complex and challenging biotechnological and biomedical research. We will run this, as you see already, it looks different than in the morning. We'll run that as a real panel, so we want to have a discussion with you. And there's this young colleague up there drawing pictures, which look very nice. And I hope later we have a lot of pictures of you on there with a lot of questions and a lot of dialogue. So, of course, the 5 or 6 of us are very nice, but let's make that a purpose of the next 1.5 hours. Before I introduce the panel here, let me give 60 seconds on the context and the objectives of this panel. So, biotechnological and biomedical research is unreplaceable, or the sine qua non of the foundation of what we all want to do, helping patients that suffer across the world, but also as a foundation for sustainable industries, many industries, or sub-industries, if you might say. So what's now the complication here? On the one hand, science is complex. Is perhaps getting more difficult because it might be a contradiction, but there are many more opportunities out there, technological opportunities, and we heard about some in the morning. So I sat here during the last talk and I felt, wow, that is interesting, but makes it even more difficult because there are more opportunities. I think it's hard to judge where and what to fund. And of course, it's also a question of global nature, how to find the right judgment, what are priorities and where to put the money. So all of these put this panel into a hopefully quite interesting context. And I would formulate the objective for now as, in this panel, we want to spend the time with you to reflect on these challenges. And we want to learn from the 5 panelists here because they represent a good cut of private and public leaders in this space. And certainly are all waiting for your questions here. And then hopefully we can draw out a few statements or hypotheses that you can use on Wednesday, because our understanding is you will do actually some of the work on Wednesday. So let's set the bar high. And along those lines, let me very briefly introduce the panel here to you. So on the one hand, we have Kate Bingham, Managing Director of SV Life Science, venture capitalist. She will give the numbers. I leave out the numbers. Then we have Robert Jan Smits. He's Director General of the DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. Then we have Dr. Pangalos. Manny Pangalos is EVP of Innovative Medicines and Early Development at AstraZeneca. Then we have Dr. Neil Weir, SVP of Discovery at UCB. And both of them share actually roles in the industry, let's say in the innovation board as one example in the ABPI. And last but not least, we have Sir William Castell, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Wellcome Trust.
Morning.
So I hope that gives you a sense. We have a broad spread here of participants. And there's only one last thing before I let the panel go. Actually, I would like to ask your opinion first, because as promised, this is about you. I will have 3 questions for you, or better, statements. The first one would be, the funding gap is one of the most severe challenges and threats. If we don't address it, it will hamper innovation in the long term. Who of you would agree? Please raise your hand. So quite some, okay? A second statement, no. The current pressure is actually good. It helps industry and private and public to open up, to collaborate. In a way, the funding pressure drives innovation. Who would agree to that? Okay, a few less. A third statement, the funding gap is a threat, yes, but particularly for diseases in the developing world and for non-mainstream areas. So yes, oncology is funded, but other areas are perhaps ignored. Who agrees to that? Okay, that helps us to calibrate a little bit, also a relatively large group. With that, let's give a chance to the panel to present their views, and Kate is starting.
Okay, thank you. Perfect, thank you. So, in the spirit of being confrontational, I was told to use no slides. So, I have produced slides because actually what I'm going to do is actually set the scene of what's going on in what we call the biotech industry, so you get a bit of a sense financially of what's happening. So, just who we are. We're a venture capital group based in London, Boston, San Francisco. We've been going for about 20 years. We've invested about $1 billion, which we've already returned to investors, $1.5 billion with another half to come. And we've got about 750 in the ground. So that gives you a sort of a scale of who we are and what we do. The biotech industry has had a phenomenal run over the last couple of years. So if you look at the actual biotech public index, so this is an index of all publicly traded companies, and this particular index is the S&P 500 Biotech Index. So if you look at the biotech index over the last 2 or 3 years, you can see that there's a dramatic outperformance of biotech versus the S&P 500, so versus the main main markets. We have had a recent correction. It's come down to sort of beginning of the year levels now, but nevertheless, this is phenomenal. And if we look over a longer period, so look over nearly 20 years, what you can see is the tech bubble, 99-2000, and that's when a lot of the internet money came into the public market thinking that biotech was the next area to invest in. And part of that, actually, I would say, was to do with Bill Castell and the Wellcome Trust, who pioneered the Human Genome Project sequencing. And the view of the public markets was, well, now we've got a map of the human genome, that means we can, we can now create medicines to everything, which of course was not true, as in it takes some time to do that. But nevertheless, that was what happened at in that particular bubble. The industry at that point was loss-making. Very few companies had any earnings, so there was really no such thing as valuing companies based on, or the industry based on PE. What you've seen then basically is a very long flat period where not very much happened in the public markets, and then you can see this very significant outperformance over the last few years. And if just from a valuation perspective, is this another bubble? We don't think so. If you look at actual both revenue growth rates and earnings growth rates, and you take the biotech industry against all other different sectors, biotech looks pretty good. So if I was looking at this as an investor with those sorts of fairly robust earnings and revenue numbers, this is the reason that the markets have come up. And if you think about the actual underlying quality of earnings, these are all driven by innovation. They're driven by launches of new products which have patents protecting the life of those products, so that they are reasonably predictable earnings, as opposed to the latest I don't know, Skype or Facebook or something, where there will be more to do with sort of consumer interest rather than actual predictable earnings, in my view. So, what has that led to? It's led to an increasing number of acquisitions by both big pharmaceutical companies, specialty pharma companies, and biotech, because biotech has been a very strong engine of this growth. We can see that both in terms of numbers of exits and in terms of sizes of exits, those have been going up. And it's often, we're starting to see earlier exits where some of the companies with particularly sort of what I call high science, which means unproven, where we're seeing actually earlier acquisitions so that the acquirer can really get involved developing that science earlier, which again, from an investment point of view, is interesting. It doesn't mean we have to always get our products right to the end of phase 3 or phase 2. We can actually think about placing some early risky investment dollars into these companies, developing some pretty broad stories. But contrary to what's going on in the public market, I think it's worth you guys all understanding what's actually going on in the venture capital market. So funds like mine, which are traditional 10-year funds where we raise money largely from pension funds to deliver returns back to those pensioners that would exceed what they could get otherwise in other asset classes. And what you can see between the two different bars, the light blue bars are the healthcare dollars invested. So these are the funds that we as VCs invest in small or medium biotech companies each year. And you can see it sort of goes up and down, but it's, I mean, maybe it's not too strong to say it's stable, but it's certainly not dropping dramatically. Yet, if you look at the funds that venture funds are raising, there is really a very significant drop. So if you look at the peak on this chart in 2007, you've got $8 billion being raised. And you compare that to 2012, where about $3 billion were raised. So we've got a big gap, and this, I think, is particularly pertinent to this conference, where we have ongoing needs from these loss-making, which they by and large research-based biotech companies are cash-consuming companies, and yet we don't have the venture dollars to fill that gap. And this is particularly surprising if you look in the context of the UK. So the UK research base, by which I would say all medical research, is about the same as Boston, the whole sort of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And yet they are raising $2 billion in early stage research funding compared with, from people like us, but all forms of research funding, compared with the UK for a similar size, broadly similar size research base, where we're raising about a quarter of that. So about $500 million. So how are we as VCs responding to this really very dramatic gap that we're seeing in the funding environment? So there are different things that we're doing. One thing is developing single asset plays. So this is where you're taking a single story, so a single target, but ultimately a single product, and developing that in a very, very virtual and low-cost way. And you may do that in collaboration or may not, but the goal would be to have a very defined set of goals without lots of backup strategies, without lots of science going on, and just saying, we are going to take this drug candidate from A to B, and because we're going to be so virtual, we're going to do it much more cheaply. The second way is that the industry is evolving, is looking at, well, what other sources of funding are there other than just what I call the plain vanilla VCs? So clearly there are charities and patient foundations, many of whom have been completely fundamental in launching or starting the science or supporting the exploitation of science, which isn't otherwise being developed. And certainly in cystic fibrosis, with the work they've done with Vertex, has been particularly useful. The grants in the UK, we have a very supportive Chancellor for life sciences, so that we've got a new scheme, the TSB Biocatalyst scheme, which has been really pretty important in funding peer-reviewed novel science to get them through to different key value inflection points, as well as R&D tax credit funding, which again is cash back to these companies to support their R&D. The Wellcome Trust, you'll hear from Bill Castell, has been completely transformational in our country and actually across the world in identifying some of these areas for gap funding, which no doubt he will talk a little bit more later. The pharmaceutical industry have themselves recognized that VCs alone can't do all the funding that is needed, and so they create their own sort of in-house venture capital groups, which again is incredibly helpful because they bring a perspective from Big Pharma saying, these are our priority areas that we need to go out and figure out how are we going to address these diseases. And they will work with all manners of funders to build and support companies. And also there are new, what I call VC-like groups. So they're not the classic 10-year venture funds that have pension funds necessarily invested. Syncona is one, again from the Wellcome Trust. Sixth Element is another one, set up by the Cancer Research UK to develop very specific cancer opportunities. And then finally, there's much, much more to do with collaboration. So to do with collaboration between companies, to do with VCs, so that we can work together earlier. And just, I think we'll get into this in the panel, but what are we as VCs doing to address some of the gaps that we're seeing? We're getting close to the customers who, for the most part for us, are the pharmaceutical industry, the biotech industry, the large guys. We are looking at how do we build better data packages, whether that's preclinical or clinical, so that the actual drugs that we end up developing actually have a high chance of success. I'm done.
Great. Perfect. Thank you very much, Kate, for the broad overview. Now let's look a little bit to the, I would say, the public side. Robert Jan, please.
Okay. From here?
You can stay seated if you prefer. It's up to you.
Well, I'm standing now already, so. All right, good morning, everyone. You probably have seen that, heard that in future the budget of the European Union is going to be smaller than it is today, with one exception, science and innovation. Science and innovation is the only area in a shrinking EU budget which will grow big time, from the current 50 billion we have to 80 billion in future. And that's quite unique. Not only will make it our future program for science and innovation called Horizon 2020 the largest program for science and innovation in the world, I think it's also recognition of the political leaders of Europe, Cameron and Merkel, that in order to get out of the economic crisis and to get growth back into our economy, we need to invest in science and innovation. So Horizon 2020 is our new program, 80 billion for the period 2014-2020. And if you look at this program, we are going to orient it very, very much towards the grand societal challenges. So we step away from a thematic approach which we had in the past. And secondly, we want to pay a lot of attention to small and medium-sized enterprises. As a matter of fact, 20% of the budget will have to go to small and medium-sized enterprises, startups and spin-offs. So that's an enormous amount of money which will be available for this motor of economic growth in the years to come. We will continue Horizon 2020 with a very successful scheme. You're probably familiar with the European Research Council, of which we're going to double the budget. And we had this morning some interesting meeting with some grant holders from the ERC. Our mobility program, Marie Sklodowska-Curie. So from that point of view, a number of our quite successful programs will be continued. If you look at it from a thematic area, the biggest money will go to health research in the years to come. And in that context, we are creating a very impressive public-private partnership with industry, Big Pharma. It's actually a continuation of a PPP we have set up with Big Pharma over the last years. It's called Innovative Medicines, IMI. A success story. In the future, we're going to put almost 3 billion into that. 50% from us, the European Commission, 50% from industry. And indeed, it's allowing to bring medication quicker to the market. We're also in that context having a very impressive program with Sub-Saharan Africa on poverty-related diseases. It's called the European Clinical Trials Platform for Poverty-Related Diseases, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, almost €1 billion, which we will deploy in order indeed to undertake clinical trials on these poverty-related diseases. It's a very successful continuation of a successful program in the past, and we recently signed an agreement with the Gates Foundation, who's also going to contribute to this program. So from that point of view, there is a lot going to happen in the years to come at European level in the field of science and innovation, and health is going to be the key focus area. We are stepping into an interesting field, which is a little bit the bridge with the previous speaker. We are developing a debt and equity financing instrument. We have had a debt financing instrument over the last years. We are now going to also undertake an equity financing instrument because indeed venture capital in Europe is not what it is in the United States, and certainly not at the moment. It has been hit big time by the economic crisis. And we're going to work with a fund of funds with European venture capital organizations to get us off the ground. So the message I want to present to you today here is that at European level we take research innovation serious. We have an enormous amount of budget for the years to come. We are keen to deploy that money in the most effective way through public-private partnership with industry and by giving a lot of room and space to small and medium-sized enterprises. But, and that is crucial, we need to continue to invest, of course, in the best brains of Europe, and therefore it's very important that we keep on investing in frontier research, as we call it, basic research which allow young people to extend the frontiers of knowledge. Now, it's not only, it's good that Europe is investing more in science innovation, but we are, of course, quite concerned by radical budget cuts at national level. We see in a number of member states of the European Union, notably Spain, Portugal, also Italy, that national science budgets has been cut. And that is something which is, of course, understandable in the short term, but it will really hamper the growth of these countries in the long run. So we are, from the side of the European Union, making a strong plea towards the countries in Europe, keep on investing in science and innovation, not only at European level, but also at national level. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for these encouraging facts. And maybe before we come to industry, Sir William, perhaps on the Wellcome Trust.
Good morning. The Wellcome Trust is a charity, an NGO. We have a large endowment which allows us to grant about £750 million a year. The question is, where do you start your granting? And how do you do it? In February, I went for 10 days to South Africa. I went to KwaZulu-Natal, where we have a population of 100,000 people under study in terms of the diseases that they are facing. We found during our visit that 100% of the population had TB. This was confirmed by a sputum test, the Gene Wizard. Costs at the moment $11 for a diagnostic test. And of that 100% of the population, there were strains which were completely resistant to current therapy. Of the 100,000 people there, we found 80% of them had HIV. Using phylogeny, we can look at we can take dry blood and we can see the nature of the genetic formation of the virus. And we found mutant strains which are no longer responding to the antiretroviral therapy. And because we are looking at the phylogeny of a defined population, we can actually define and start to question how that disease is being transmitted, either 100 yards or 20 kilometers. And in the local population, there's a lot of talk about the sex worker and the sugar daddy, but there's actually no discussion of the behavioral issues associated with the transfer of that disease. In Durban, there's a great partnership with the Howard Hughes organization. And so what we're facing is the epicenter of TB and HIV against an epicenter of world-class molecular biology, nanoscience, which allows us to actually look at a changing population on a weekly basis. In Cape Town, it was great to see how the basic research has been strengthened in Cape Town University. Great to see how the clinical research is really taking hold. And even more informing was to see when the Department of Health came to discuss with the university how well informed the Department of Health were in terms of the allocation of their scarce resources and how they were using their policy levers to do their best possible response to extraordinary levels of disease, to unfortunately a declining longevity. When they started to treat AIDS in South Africa around 2004, the age expectation went from 52 to 60. We're now seeing a rapid decline because of the breakout of these resistant strains. So at one end, here you are at an epicenter of disease in diseases which we're not immune from them in the Western world. It's a case of really understanding what we thought in the past we dealt with is reoccurring. Now, many of you in this room, when you get to 2050, will be around my age. And in 2050, you're going to have 9 billion people, at least in this world. And 75% of those people will be in the urban community. So you have an extraordinary challenge in terms not only of the resources of the world, but how you're going to maintain a free society, civil behavior, reasonable expectation as to health, and how we're going to maintain a sustainable world. So, for me, what's happened in my lifetime are two things. The health of the world is now inseparable to the health of humankind, because we are so dominant as a species, we really are consuming the resources of the earth. And so it is possible that by 2050 you'll have the privilege that I've had, including reasonable longevity and an absolute opportunity of freedom. How you get there, how we resource you, how we train you, how we create the market that allows us to bring solutions is really about where you're going to stand on our shoulders to make sure you make a better job of today's challenges, and we don't look much back historically. So what we do at Wellcome, we have a vision of extraordinary improvements in human and animal health, and we do this by supporting outstanding researchers. We fund across the spectrum, whether it's basic research, blue skies, applied, clinical, or translation. We fund through different mechanisms. We fund people through fellowships, investigative awards, and strategic awards. We fund specific platforms. UK Biobank has a signed-up population of 500,000 who've opted to put all of their phenotype and genotype into a bank where we can look at the progression of disease and look at a large-scale population. We fund Diamond, which has given us great clues in terms of X-ray crystallography, and a new product has come out of there, which is a protein shell, which is fooling the immune system that it is actually a virus and creating a new vaccine capability. We fund through places, so we are a partner in the CRIC, which is about world-class molecular sciences integrated, we hope successfully, with convergent technologies in maths and physics and engineering. So we really have a centre of translation at the heart of London. We fund in partnership with the NIH, with the Department of Health in the Healthcare Innovation Fund. It's a £100 million fund where we're really trying to put research back into the NHS. We fund through products in a technology transfer scheme. Kate was at one time on the panel. We started the panel in 2002. We funded 300 projects, largely out of academia, some, however, out of industry. We committed £550 million, and we've had follow-up funding of £1.2 billion from investors coming in to support those initiatives, which we started to fund as we saw it in the pre-competitive stage. In terms of new initiatives, we set up a joint three-way partnership with the British government and GSK in forming the Stevenage Biocatalyst. We have 30 acres on the GSK site, the chance of building 1 million square feet of translation and incubator space. In the first year and a half, 100,000 square feet has gone. The last company to sign up was Tokyo Electric, who make semiconductors, but they want to get into stem cells, so they've arrived at the Stevenage Biocatalyst. So, and then finally, Syncona. So when we get down to the funding arm, we have set up Syncona. It's an evergreen fund. It does not have a 10-year term. And we've done that specifically because we feel the part of the funding gap, if you look at the life cycle of life sciences, it's very difficult to raise the funds, make an investment, and get an exit in a 10-year period. And if you look at maturity on some of the great companies we've had up there today, then maturity in terms of return to the investor is often a 20 to 30-year term. So I think when we look at funding, it's very much we need to look at how we encourage patient capital, how we structure that, how we can we give liquidity to the investor and yet have a patient capital structure that allows us to make the type of investment that not only takes the technology into the clinic, but also critically creates a manufacturing capacity. Because without manufacturing, you don't get the economic impact to finish the virtual circle, where government has the funds to invest in the knowledge-based economy, because it not only creates opportunity, but it creates employment, taxes, and a healthy economy. So going forward, I think we're going to have much more about partnerships with the Wellcome Trust, working with not only governments but other NGOs. We're going to have much more about funding in terms of patient capital, but our requirement from government is a change in the regulatory regime that allows us to deal with the opportunities of personalized medicine, and doesn't mean that we have to wait for 12 years for the end clinical trial point. We need to fund new mechanisms that deal with technology which is targeted at the individual, not because the blockbuster would do better, but because we've learned something from genetics, that their disease has a unique genetic profile that allows us to treat it and therefore change for many people for their entire lives, extraordinary genetic diseases which are inherited, for which at the moment there is no cure. So I think, and finally, I think we have a duty in the foundation to find a much greater democratization of knowledge. The political strategic framework in many instances now seems to be months or even minutes as our politicians wrestle with democracy in the era of Facebook. We need, the world of knowledge needs to better democratize its knowledge, so we create more interest in the voter in how science and technology talks to the strategic routes that government should go. So I am very much hoping that we can find the way for improving the democratization of quite profound knowledge, whether it's in climate change, whether it's in disease processes, whether it's in the way that we eat and the way we're challenged by obesity. All of these things, we need to do a better job in the scientific community of popularizing the knowledge that we're creating. Thank you.
Thank you. I imagine questions are piling up, but let's hear first Neil and Mene. Neil, if you want to start.
Sure, thanks, Matthias. So, well, good morning, everyone. So I'd first of all like to declare where I'm coming from. So, like many, leading some part of research and early development in my case, a medium-sized pharma. So my perspective on funding comes from that, and I think what I'm going to describe is, I think there's very often many perspectives, and they're almost all useful and correct, and the more we can understand them all, I think it puts us in a better position to understand how we will ultimately get funded. So at UCB, we're running two core drivers. One, we're running a portfolio that combines small molecules and antibodies, and we keep them very much together rather than separate, because we sort of regard the entity itself as a means to an end rather than the end in itself. And perhaps at some point we'll be able to fuse the two so that we learn from the way antibodies interact, or other biologicals interact with their targets and change their shapes and get small molecules to do that. And the second area or driver is around understanding disease better, and perhaps using human genetics to understand disease and the stratification of disease. And I'll mention very briefly an example of a project we have where we've learned enormously from human genetics of one rare disease and applied that to understand driving mechanisms into a broader disease population. So I wanted to break it down into what we fund, which, at least from where I sit in my role, is almost the critical factor, because getting that right and explaining that well is a critical part of getting it funded. But I'll also touch on how we fund it. And I think what we fund is fascinating, actually, because it's a combination of science and people and perspectives and where people are coming from. Because I think it's very interesting. I would suggest to all of you that I suspect you have self-selected by coming here, because almost by definition, you're the sort of gregarious, engaging colleagues who will have a very critical role to play in the future, connecting with some of your colleagues who are probably back at the lab now, never leave the lab, and are very introverted and don't naturally enjoy this type of environment. But I think it's a critical role that you will play to find the connectivity between all these different styles. And I think it's great that we've got Sir Greg here, because I think he's been a terrific example of how you connect great fundamental science with actually explaining that to funders and VCs who actually might not necessarily relate to the detail, and then the inclination to go further into the detail and explain to someone why they're perhaps not getting it. We better explain it much more meticulously, but actually understanding where they're coming from. So it's sort of connectivity between great science and understanding how people come at things. So some fundamentals about what we would like to work on. Well, the starting point, I think, is need, at least for working in the pharmaceutical industry. Do we understand the patient need well enough? But as soon as I say that, I'd also like to be a little bit controversial, because I'm not sure, everybody says that's the fundamental driver, but I think if you look carefully at what's been successful, I'm not sure it always has started from really understanding the gap in a patient. I wasn't there doing antibody engineering in the early days that Greg was leading it, but I have done it for about 25 years. And what I've seen, I suspect, and it'd be interesting to have the debate, it wasn't the desire to cure non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that led to the ability to isolate monoclonal antibodies or human. It was just a knowledge that this technology was going to be really neat and very, very broadly applicable, and it will find it'll find any number of homes when it gets there. So I think there's a component where actually neat science has to overlap with patient need. And if you do things purely by trying to understand patient need, you may be fishing without a great deal of chance of finding it. So you've got to complement it with really, really good science, differentiated. And I don't incidentally suggest we go to the other extreme and say we just do neat science and hope something will turn up as a useful application of it. I think it's a question of finding the overlap between the two. Incidentally, we talked, so I'm going to talk a little bit about personal prejudice. I'll give you an example of this. I happen to be a huge enthusiast for bispecific antibodies, but I'm not sure yet I know exactly what disease, because I think it will take us into a territory of drug mechanism that's quite different to the mechanism at the moment. So I'm not talking about having two independent drugs happening to be in the same molecule, complementing each other. I'm talking about having bispecifics that actually bring two things together and start actually to use drugs that interact with biology rather like biology drives itself, which is actually connective and multiple rearrangement. I mean, the immune synapse is a fantastically rich area of potential for moving things around and bringing them into contact with each other, for which, with some exceptions, drugs haven't yet done. So the second area of sort of making selections about the what, or science, obviously I've mentioned already, and to what extent do we understand the connection between the science and the disease? And just one very brief example I'd give here is a project that we have done in collaboration with Amgen. It was a project that started off in Seattle, basically around systems biology and the ability through SNP analysis to understand the human genome better of patients suffering from rare diseases. They found a population of Afrikaans patients who had incredibly dense bone, but generally normal bone. It then translated through that, in fact, there was a premature stop codon in a protein which excluded a protein called sclerostin, which turns out to be a fairly principal handbrake on bone deposition. Now, that didn't tell us about osteoporosis, but it told us about a really fundamental mechanism driving human biology, which could then be transposed onto an osteoporotic population, and so far looking quite interesting. So having some sort of really, really neat cutting-edge science and the connection to patients. The final area of connection to patients, so again I'm going to be perhaps controversial. I actually believe stratification is a whole lot more than making money from pharmaceutical companies, for pharmaceutical companies. I think it's going to be critical, because actually most drugs do what they are intended to do. One of the big gaps is, do we know what the patient population is? And in that vast collection that we describe as, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis patients or lupus patients, there may be an enormous heterogeneity, and we're just asking our drug to treat a disease that isn't a disease. It's a multiplicity of diseases, and we just haven't yet understood the subsets that are most applicable to our drugs. So we're very enthusiastic about stratifying. So we ensure that we give drugs to patients who will benefit and avoid giving drugs to patients who will not benefit, because almost all drugs are very potently pharmacologically active entities that have downsides as well as upsides. So optimizing that, of course, is important. And then finally, differentiation. I think ultimately you've got to be confident you're going to do it as well, if not better, than others. We could perhaps, as we go on, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, talk about the balance, risk versus security, incremental versus paradigm shift. Essentially, if you're working a job like me, I think essentially you want to have a balance, but you want to have some principles that on the whole you have to do something very significantly different now, otherwise the payors will not be particularly enthusiastic. I think one thing that's really interesting, and actually the Vice Chancellor mentioned it earlier on, is bottom-up versus top-down. I think it's tremendously important to have bottom-up science, because you've got to find a way of bridging the conflict between grey-haired people, like most of sitting in this, who actually have been there, done lots, and therefore know why it won't work, versus young, enthusiastic people who actually probably don't know what they don't know, but that with that comes a terrific ability to have a greater vision. And I think a balance of that, it's actually not easy to find. It's not easy to find for people sitting, because you have a responsibility to account for what you're investing in. Sometimes if you see something you don't think is going to work, it's quite difficult to have the confidence to encourage your people to invest in it. But I think you actually have to invest, but you have to make judgment, which is what we're going to talk about, judgment around people and individuals. So I think I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Neil. So last but not least, Menelas, the easiest to react to, though.
Right.
But no.
Thanks, Matthias. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. And probably the first thing to say is I've never been more excited as a sort of someone working in the pharmaceutical industry. I think we're at a tipping point for many diseases, and I've never been more excited about being an R&D leader in a company than at any time in my career. And that's despite many of the challenges that you've heard about. So the challenges that I'm sure you've talked about this morning around the increased genericization and pressure on our patents, the increased complexity of the diseases that we're trying to treat, the more challenging payer environment that Neil's just talked about, where it's not enough to just get approved by a regulator, but you also have someone to pay for your drug. The fact that regulators are being much more demanding in terms of the hurdles that you have to jump over to get your drug approved, whether it's the size of the trials you have to do, the lack of safety signals, the efficacy they're looking for. So our environment has become much, much more difficult. But I think as a consequence of that, we've had to change how we work. And I think that's a really exciting thing, because I think now when you look at how universities work, how groups like the Wellcome Trust or the MRC or the NIH or biotech, we're all realizing that to be successful, we have to work together. We can't do this in isolation. And I think that for me is, I think, a really exciting thing, because there's a lot of power putting us all together and actually trying to solve problems together. Now, having said that, one of the other things I think as an industry that we're doing very, very different to what we were doing maybe 5-10 years ago. And I remember in one of my previous companies I worked at, where I was in a meeting and someone was talking about how we industrialize R&D, how we sort of, if we put 10 candidates in, we'll get 1 drug out. Therefore, if we put 100 candidates in, we'll get 10 drugs out. So what everyone did was build lots of infrastructure and buildings and hired lots of people, and they ended up putting 100 candidates in, but they still only got 1 drug out. That was a big problem and led, I think, to this huge productivity issue that we have as an industry, but that we've also learned from today. And I think we're working very, very differently today than we were 5 or 10 years ago. And just to give you some examples of the types of things, just using AstraZeneca and MedImmune, you'll hear from Bahidra a little bit later on in the day, some of the things that we're doing differently, not just as AstraZeneca, but I think as an R&D ecosystem. So collaboration we have with both the MRC and the NIH, something called NCATS, where we're actually making our compounds available to MRC or NIH investigators to find utility for. So we have compounds that are sitting on our shelves. We're not quite sure what to do with them. They failed for efficacy or other reasons in the clinic. And we're making them available to people to say, you know what, find a better use for these molecules because we can't think of what to do with these things. We've had some phenomenal applications and things that are starting to run where drugs are being repositioned from being used for hypertension to being used to run experiments in Alzheimer's disease, moving from Alzheimer's disease to oncology. So real repositioning of drug candidates to try and test hypotheses or ideas about new pathways. Collaboration we have with Karolinska Institute in the area of cardiovascular metabolic disease, where we're putting AstraZeneca and MedImmune scientists in the same building as Karolinska scientists, working side by side, trying to track and understand new pathways, new targets, new biology in the cardiovascular metabolic space. We just recently announced, actually today, a collaboration with the MRC, where the MRC are going to put their screening group in our new building in Cambridge, where we're going to have our scientists working side by side to screen new targets, new pathways, and hopefully identify new ways of hitting those targets and pathways, side by side. This is a very, very different way of working. I think if you'd asked a pharmaceutical company 10 years ago to put NIH investigators or Cambridge academics or MRC investigators in the same building, we would have said, oh, no, absolutely not. All our information is proprietary. I remember being at a meeting actually a few weeks ago. We were talking about this, about how there was a perception that industry wanted to suck academia dry and not give anything back. I think if we both give to the relationship, if we're able to contribute our know-how, our expertise, and combine that with the great science that happens around the world, I think you have a much more powerful R&D ecosystem. And I think that's very, very exciting. It's something that I'm particularly passionate about. Of course, there are things that I think, just talking parochially about the UK, that I think we do, and we touched on them a little bit earlier. I think things like the patent box, the equity base that we have here is good, and I think the government is very much trying to incentivize R&D. But I think the stats that you put out, just comparing us to Boston, why is it that in Boston there's $2 billion worth of money being raised for venture, for new ideas, for new targets, for new biotechs, and in the UK, which has more than its fair share of great science, if you actually look at the science that's happening just in Oxford, Cambridge, London, you compare that to Boston or the Bay Area, we're as good as they are. And yet the amount of money we can raise to start biotechs and spur new companies up is a fraction of what happens in the US, and there's a reason for that. And so one of the questions I have for you is, looking at Greg and Niels, how do we create more Greg Winters in the UK? But not complete, not just like you, Greg, but a little bit like you. Because there's something about, and it's not about maybe training entrepreneurs, but how do we identify those new ideas, those sparky science that have a great idea, and really encourage them and develop them to start a new company? There's something that's missing. We can sort of have a little bit to sort of get them started, but then getting them to the next step, I think there's a gap in the funding there. I think that is something that I think we could really talk about and help with in the UK, and that we need to do better. But overall, the NHS, I think, is another example. That's just looking at my notes. How do we make the NHS, which I think is a real opportunity for us in the UK, a cutting-edge powerhouse in terms of helping us do clinical trials, get access to innovative medicines, and really make sure that we use its capability to help us become an R&D powerhouse? It's something I think is quite special. I don't think we're taking full advantage of the NHS yet. And so I think overall, very optimistic. I'm really excited about how we're changing working between pharma, biotech, and the public sector. I think it's going much, much better. And and I'm obviously very, very excited about our move to Cambridge, and that's part of the reason for coming to Cambridge and moving our R&D headquarters here, is because we want to be more open, more porous, more collaborative, and interacting more strongly with very, very high caliber scientists. Thank you.
So it's a long time ago I was in the lab, but still, this sounds exciting. Collaboration is a big theme, starting from Kate. How the venture capitalists try, or other companies try to get into that space and fund all the way to many, talking about also different ways of working. But I don't want to do a long summary. Actually, I know you want to get going. So wherever, I see already. So where do we start? Wherever is the microphone nearest. So maybe we start here in this corner.
Hi, thank you for sharing your views. My question comes from what I observe around me amongst other grad students, and it seems that we have finite amounts of funds and resources for a vast number of ideas. So what ends up happening, and this is just based on my observation, is that the funds go to the bigger names, like they'll go to Harvard, MIT, Cambridge, Oxford, and a lot of other universities or second, third tier universities don't get those funds. In your observation, is this is this what is happening? And secondly, are we missing out on innovative ideas because of that?
Great question, I have to say. Not the most easy one. I look for any volunteers. Somebody wants to comment.
Let me just take it on as an investor. Yeah. The base companies get get formed with the collaboration of people around side. And so if you are basically a single entrepreneurial scientist with no other companies around you, actually you've got nobody to go and have a cup of coffee with and saying, how on earth do I have a meeting with, you know, the bank, the venture capitalist, the patent agent, blah, blah, blah. And so if you don't have that infrastructure, it is really difficult to start. It's not to say there won't be some great innovations coming out of lesser universities, but by and large, actual inventions, there is a straight line correlation between dollars invested in medical research and patents coming out. So that as a funder, you know, why do I rob banks? I go because that's where the money is. I mean, that's where I go to find innovative ideas. And I know there is an infrastructure, maybe not as well developed as in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but here, certainly there's a pretty good infrastructure, and you'll be able to find people who have been and done everything you need to do to build up and develop a drug. And in other places, you may not be able to. So that there is a regional development aspect to this, but given that we've got such big gaps, even in the strongest centres in the UK, I kind of think we need to fix those gaps pretty urgently.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, ultimately a good idea is a good idea irrespective of geography and location. But I think the point you're making is exactly right. It's much more likely to flourish when you're surrounded by people that are like-minded and where you can sort of learn and be part of a community. And again, one of the reasons why we're moving down here is for exactly that reason, because it's easier then to recruit into the space. If you're starting a new company, you can find it much easier to recruit and attract people. It becomes much easier to form a network because there are other people that are doing the same sort of thing, even if it's in different areas. And you have a community that's actually competing with, with Boston and with the Bay Area. And one of the challenges, again, it is a difficult thing to say, is that, you know, Oxford, Cambridge, London seems to be kind of, you know, an R&D ecosystem. My personal view is you can't spread it all over the UK. It really, because it actually doesn't compete. If you think about how Boston works, there isn't a biotech sector all over America. It's in Boston. New York has tried to do it, it's trying to do it. They may or may not be successful. Other countries, other cities, you know, the DC area is another one where I think it's growing. But I think it is something where you have to focus, because it is a skill set, it is a mindset, and you want to have the ecosystem around it as well. So I think, you know, we have an asset in the Oxford, Cambridge, London triangle where we have some of the world's best scientists and some very good biotech companies and big pharma all in that same area. We need to capitalize on that and take advantage of it.
Robert, quick comments, then we move on.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
That's one of the problems which we have also with our Brussels programs, because we are selecting projects purely based on excellence. And that means that out of these billions which we spend from Brussels on science innovation, a lot ends up here in the UK, in Israel, in Switzerland, the Netherlands and Sweden, but not in, for instance, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria. And yet, are we going to change our policy? The answer is no. We can only compete with the rest of the world based on quality and excellence, and not with mediocrity. That does not mean that we should not help capacity being built up in other places of Europe. And therefore, the structural funds of the European Union are there to help indeed these lesser developed parts of Europe to build up capacity in the field of science and innovation. But the European Science Programme, Innovation Programme will always be based on selection, based on one criteria only, that's excellence.
Right. Thank you for that. Let's maybe go here further to the middle.
Thank you very much. My question is for the entire panel, because I hope all of you could give me more clues. I know some organizations mainly aim at the social welfare, such as the public health or science communication for young people. This kind of organization could only produce the economic or the social impact in the long run. So my question would be, for this organization, what kind of suggestions you could give them to seek more funding? Thank you.
Thank you.
Perhaps first reaction, we had in the past in our European science programs a dedicated program for social science and humanities. And that meant that they stuck in the silos and did not contribute to finding ground societal solutions, solutions to the ground societal challenges. We have decided now to stop our social sciences and humanities program, and we want indeed that inside, for instance, our health program, the social sciences and humanities are really present. Because we talk about issues like neurodegenerative diseases, if we talk about Alzheimer's, this is not just about inventing a new drug, it's also about how do we organize our society with millions of people who are going to be suffering from this disease. Obesitas, it's another issue. This is not just getting a drug on the market, there's also socioeconomic behavior dimension to it. So we are more and more involving in our projects, society, social sciences and humanities to work together with physical sciences, engineering, to jointly find solutions. And I think we have been too much obsessed by purely the natural sciences in the past. We need to bring the different disciplines together, and that will be a big challenge for the programs to come.
I went to see the Weizmann Institute and was very impressed by the science and how much they've progressed since the late 40s. And I said, but you haven't got a faculty here of the humanities. And the president said, no, we won't do that. That would be a silo. So every program here has someone from the behavioral sciences appointed to work with the scientists on the behavioral issues, which I thought was, I said, you scored too much. It was brilliant.
Yeah. Great. I know he has some questions in the front. We'll get there.
Hi, my name is Pauline. It works, okay. Yeah. From Imperial College, and I think my question is, we all know that there is a very big gap between what is going on in the academia in terms of the research and actually when it goes out to the industry. How can we minimize this gap? Because usually it's related to the technology transfer office and this funding and collaborations. How can we minimize this gap and bringing more and faster all the innovation from the academia?
So just a clarification, you mean speed in terms of...
Yes.
Okay. That's maybe a question to our Neil. You want to take?
Yeah, well, perhaps I could start. GAP sounds quite sort of critical. I think there are facets where there are different tasks, and there are facets where there are combined tasks. So in my opinion, I don't think we should encourage academic colleagues to focus exclusively on things which have a practical application. I think it's entirely right that we do science in all areas for the fundamental purpose of learning more about things. It's quite difficult for industry to do that because it's quite difficult to justify, because you don't. That's not to say we don't do it, we do some of it. So I think there are perfectly legitimate areas where there's a slightly different focus. But then when it comes to the application, I don't think there's quite as much of a gap as you describe. And there's probably scope for us doing better and on both dimensions. But actually, I often hear people saying, well, you would not be interested in that because your industry is far too early. Actually, industry get involved in very, very fundamental early things, trying to understand biology. And of course, quite rightly, academic colleagues get involved in things that are very applied. So I'm not sure clearly we have to keep working at it, but I think there's a gap that's appropriate, but there's an area where I think there's not as much of a gap as may be perceived.
I think this university has done well to bring in AstraZeneca to the campus. I think it's a partnership. Innovation is a partnership between basic science and industry. And the more you can have the co-location of those systems, so there's trust and interface and questioning between the two, is great. And then on the commercial development side, when you get to your licensing department, you find that licensing goes much better if you're dealing with a business person that's done translation rather than the lawyer who wants to work on the legal agreement. And so, and I think thirdly, it's very important what the Vice Chancellor said here today, that the goal here is impact, not reward. And some universities, you get mixed messages, which is they are keen to license out the science, but they want the royalty returns, which leads to a negotiation over years, whereas one hopes that you've completed the legals and got on with the partnership as soon as possible. But at the end of the day, it's the culture, the expectation from the students and from industry that there is a good partnership we had, a trusting partnership, and we should do more and more to encourage that culture.
Thank you for that. Let's maybe move here to the front. Here. Here. Just in the very front. Very front.
Hi, I'm Chris Lowe from the University of Cambridge here. I look in front of me and I see a panel of experts, a very distinguished panel, but they're all from big business and big funders. Now, there is actually a revolution in biology taken from the other end of the spectrum, and I was looking down the other end of the telescope, which is actually being enacted by the general public and involving garages. So you have what's often referred to as garage biology now, and this is often funded by crowdfunding. Now, there are some examples recently where actually quite large sums of money have been raised for this type of activity. And the question is, does the panel see that this is an alternative route of funding, and will it eventually feed into the sort of activities that you described so far?
Interesting question. And here was, I mean, if I throw something in, I mean, here was a discussion of competition with large clusters, large diseases, and could that be a very different way? I mean, would be interested to see who reacts and wants to comment on that question.
Okay, I mean, I can take a shot at it. I mean, it depends what it is you're trying to fund. If you're trying to establish the relevance of a particular pathway in a particular disease and develop a new product from scratch, intervening in that pathway, the chance of being able to do that with crowdfunding, in my view, is pretty slim, because the amounts of money involved are just very significant. Having said that, if you're looking for a specific diagnostic or something that's more tangible, that's not going to require, $50 million to get to a value inflection point, sure. And I don't think there's any competition here. I mean, we are all interested in finding the big ideas that can ultimately lead to impacts in human health, and whether it comes from crowdfunding or a Citizens Innovation Fund, which is one of the other ideas of how can you get a broader collection of people to actually care about science and put their own money to support some of this. I think it's relevant. It's just very crudely, you need, I mean, certainly in my mind, I'd be interested on the big pharma side, we think we need to raise between at least $10 million and often as much as 50 to get a new product of addressing what's probably a new target to a point of value inflection, which it normally is some level of efficacy in that patient population as well as showing safety. Now, if you can shortcut it and come up with, it's an established target but a new approach, or, there are shortcuts where maybe you can get that down to single-digit millions, but you're still most likely talking about millions of dollars. And crowdfunding for millions of dollars or pounds is probably a bit challenging. But
I agree with that. I think it's very, particularly if you don't know kind of the area, what challenges you have to solve to get yourself forward. One of the things that we're just launching is something that we're calling an open innovation site, where we're actually going to have small grants available to anyone that has an idea they want to do something. They can then use our capabilities, whether it's doing DMPK screening or safety or in vitro assays, if we think that the idea is of merit. So that can be anything from a $50,000 grant to a $200,000 grant. But I do think ultimately the idea of coming up with something that's going to be tangible enough to want to fund it. I think a diagnostic is something, if you had a diagnostic company personally, that's very complicated as well. I think it's very difficult to get something that would be very tangible out of someone's garage, in all honesty.
But before we move on, can I throw something in here, because it's an interesting observation on us, actually the six of us. I mean, here funders and people excited about innovation. So are we potentially, as a group here, too positive? Because there are payers out there, and many, you started that a little bit, very critical on incremental innovation and should we pay for it. Science perhaps drives us into smaller markets, which makes it even more difficult to justify and create the value inflection point, Kate, you talked about. So are we potentially all here too positive, and it's actually, for the next generation, much more difficult to create funding and create the innovation that's required?
Well, I mean, we shouldn't be in this industry if we're not positive. 90% of drugs that go into man will fail. And the drugs that actually get to market, again, less than 50% will actually return the cash that's been invested to get them there. So we have to be absolutely as positive as we can be to be in this industry, because otherwise we're just in the wrong place. So I think this inevitably is positive. And the fact is, yes, there are still lots of very significant challenges we face, but incremental steps are helpful. And one example, in the US, the FDA has announced a new breakthrough therapy designation, which is taking drugs which have a very profound effect in diseases for which there is no or little treatment options, and saying, right, we will we will allow you, once you've proven safety, we will give you an uber fast track to get that drug to market. Now that's had a big effect on the biotech industry, which you saw some of the stats. Now, again, in the UK, we've taken a little step towards that. So there's a new process that's been announced called Open Access, or I forget what the actual title is. Accelerated access. The only catch with the UK government is they're just not willing to pay for the medicine. So they're saying, well, we'll allow you to develop a medicine more quickly, but by the way, you have to give it away. Now, that's not a great incentive, but at least it's a step forward, which ultimately, hopefully, we can get to something like the FDA, the breakthrough therapy, because I think that has been a very profound way of speeding up the whole clinical development and how can you get these innovative new drugs to patients more quickly.
Great, thank you. Let's go there, perhaps.
Hello. Hi, my name is Julia Van Lee. In the innovation value chain that we've talked about today of discovery, development, and delivery, my question is on delivery. In bringing these access and to new technologies, we've seen great advancements through the Millennium Development Goals for low-income countries, such as the $25+ billion that's going into the Global Fund for HIV, TB, and malaria, trying to bridge some of the gaps in delivery. I wondered for the panelists' thoughts on delivery for non-communicable diseases and what will happen in the future in 2050 when we tackle challenges of oncology, diabetes, and heart disease.
Excellent.
Well, there's no question that we're seeing longevity in the developing nations, and along with that, whether you go to India or Africa, the issues of obesity and the comorbidities with that are truly challenging when you look at what we're going to have to respond to. At the end of the day, we have to find market mechanisms that will deal with the delivery of the drugs. So international charity will never be affordable. But we have to have a level of investment to demonstrate the efficacy and that we can deal with these. You know, we need to show that we can respond in an affordable way for those societies in terms of the development of chronic diseases. And the issue is on both industry's head and on the charities. And I say industry because I believe nowadays for the big pharmaceutical companies, they have to demonstrate they're a good corporate citizen. They're accountable to the globe for delivering healthcare through their capabilities, and it isn't just a question of picking off the diseases where they believe there's rich pickings. So I think their requirement to demonstrate their relevance in terms of the assets they control is much clearer. But at the end of the day, life is going to be determined by the market. And the biggest tests, I believe, I mean, I've done business in China, it's still central purchase. You go to India, then it's either a local charity or it's the rupee from the farmer. And they are the most demanding. I think India is the most price competitive, demanding market I've ever seen anywhere in the world. If we can make healthcare delivered there, as we leave behind the legacy institutions which deliver healthcare in the West and move to a new model of healthcare, which is much more personalized in its delivery, I do believe we can make it more affordable. But it goes back to your question, sir. You know, the traditional industry hasn't really embraced digitization, big data, smart technology. And if I was to do anything in a garage, I'd say I'd like to look at the cloud and see how I combine the resources of this area to better deliver healthcare. And I bet your bottom dollar, if I look at all of the resources in the healthcare through big data, I can do a much better job of delivering healthcare than divided at small and divided as we stand today. At the end of the day, you have to deliver to the market. We can't do global programs.
Okay. Let's go up there. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi, this is Marcella coming from the other Cambridge. So a recurring theme among your speeches was that you guys are trying to identify not only science, but also people to fund them, right? And it seems like all the big money now goes not only to the big institutions, but also to the big shots within these big institutions. And it's very hard for young scientists to acquire large funding and establish large scientific programs within their labs. And these I have seen throughout my years at Harvard that is very intimidating and discouraging for a lot of my colleagues, and they try to find other routes of moving forward with their careers. What do you think should be done, and what is currently being done to kind of identify the new scientists and the new group of people that will bring in new ideas in the field?
Could I pose that to industry? Because Robert Jan talked a little bit about excellence as one mechanism. How do, I mean, maybe many on?
I think it's, again, you look for, we actually look for young investigators, not necessarily the big, they're often much easier to work with than the big shots. So I think what you want to try and find is young up-and-coming scientists that are publishing great work, doing great research in areas of interest that we work in, and actually we fund them. And we collaborate with them. And actually I think MRC and Wellcome also have a number of programs where they try and have sort of startup grants for young investigators. So I think, I think what you're asking more is, are we doing enough? Because I think there are things that are being done to encourage young investigators and to give them sort of the next step up to start their careers and to get their labs built. But I think the question is, do we do enough? Within our company, we definitely look for young investigators as potential collaborators, and we work out how to fund their work.
I think this is the topic of the next panel, so you could ask that question again.
But perhaps on that one, I mean, I fully understand it. If you look, for instance, at our public-private partnership, which we did, Innovative Medicine School with Big Pharma, they're represented here. We put 3 billion into a common pot. A lot of people say, well, it's nice for the big pharma. Well, there's not a euro going to the big pharma. It all goes to academia and startups, spin-offs, and small and medium-sized enterprises. Of our total future budget, the 80 billion I mentioned, 20% has to go to small and medium-sized enterprises. If you look at the European Research Council, the ERC, one of the most successful parts of the ERC is the early stage. To brilliant young scientists to set up their own research lab. So we pay an enormous amount of attention, more and more, to indeed newcomers, small and medium-sized enterprises, and young dynamic researchers who want to move forward in their life. So from that point of view, we have changed our policy very, very much towards the new ones.
Sure. I mean, I think the reality is it's a challenge, and I don't think we can wave a magic wand and say it will no longer be like that, because there's all sorts of reasons for it being the way it is. But I think one of the things we can do, and to a degree I think we're doing it, is to put more effort into selecting partnerships and not do it on the basis of they must be good because they're in, which of course and there's a lot of security to that, because you'll be collaborating with someone who's working in a fantastically creative and collegiate environment. But I think we can also, as we do actually, because I think a lot of this comes down to individuals. We've talked around collaboration, partnership, which of course is very important, but actually individuals who have the drive, who just decide that their world and life is going to be getting this through, are critical components of making these things work. And I think, to a degree, a lot of responsibility is back on us to go and do the extra hard work, to go and find who's really differentiated. And that could be, and we have got some fantastic, so we've got some strategic collaborations with Harvard and Oxford, but we've got more collaborations individually. I'm not about to try and make judgments about who's top tier and bottom tier, but with some that perhaps universities that you might not regard as, who are just bringing fantastic science, because you happen to have found an individual who's got the drive and extraordinary capacity to attract funding, which almost comes back to your point, maybe that's what makes them different. So we've got a job to do to ensure we make the extra effort to go and find out who's really special in this area and who's really differentiated.
Great.
Hi, I'm Gene from Caltech. I was wondering what your thoughts are on funds being put together in emerging regions. So I've heard of funds in like Russia and China, and also Texas in the United States, where not that it's an emerging region, but they'll basically give biotech entrepreneurs a certain amount of money, but there are many conditions that have to be met, like you have to move to Shanghai, or you have to use Texas suppliers for your work. So I was wondering what your thoughts are.
So certainly, I mean, if I pick it up for a second, I mean, here was a theme around excellence, and areas like Boston, London, Cambridge, UK came up. And of course, I mean, one could argue, are these enough regions, enough clusters? I mean, in brackets, maybe not. The question is a little bit how, let's say, the various participants here see it. I don't know. I mean, maybe from the industry side. Okay, you have one?
So there's, an example of the German government, probably 10, 15 years ago, started handing out a ton of money because they wanted to create the German biotech sector. And actually, it wasn't successful. So they were able to hand out a lot of money. They attracted some venture and other funding alongside it. But actually, it didn't lead to a enormous, dominance of the European biotech market, in my view. Now, maybe everyone disagrees with me. Because I don't think it was stringent enough in terms of how do they actually hand out that money. So I'm absolutely all in favour of allocating money to different regions and to different groups and to different sectors of the industry, but it has to be done with a reasonably high bar to say this isn't just go away and come back and tell us what you've got. We want to be pretty sure that you've got something that really is innovative or clever, or your background is strong, or something that isn't just handing out a lot of money, because it wasn't successful. If you looked at, again, in the .com peak in Europe, the German companies tended to be valued twice as highly as the equivalent on NASDAQ, and you could just tell it was non-sustainable. And some of those companies have succeeded, and they've been turned into robust, strong companies. But if you look at the groundswell of companies that got funded, many of them failed, and you could tell at the beginning that they weren't going to work. Yeah. But I'd like some people to disagree with that, because that was quite a strong statement.
I think it's a dynamic, and it comes back to something we were talking about before, top-down versus bottom-up. I think strategies that say we want to be doing X or Y in this area, now go off and find something interesting to do, work significantly less well to saying, go and find where the best science is, where the best differentiated, and we'll do it there. And of course, you can layer on top of that, and if it happens to be in the following areas, it would have some additional advantages. But I think my experience is the nature of scientists, and probably almost all of them, and we've probably all gone through this phase, is when somebody top-down says, we've decided it's a good idea for you to do the following, you kind of react against it. Whereas if we come to scientists and say, these are the problems we want to solve, so you're doing it not on the basis of a sort of big global strategy, but you're doing it on the basis of where's the really neatest science that's best aligned with our understanding of, in our case, patient unmet need, but it could be also, Bill's case could be agriculture or whatever, as well as patient needs. So whatever the problem is you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I agree completely. Throwing money at things doesn't always work.
Maybe there in the back. We have ignored the back a little bit.
Jörg Kessler, Auckland University in New Zealand. I've just heard from one of you guys saying that there's a lot more seed funding now available, and SMEs, etc., are being supported. On the other hand, I talk quite a bit to VC people or to investment manager, big pharma and so on, and they're saying they're looking at thousands of applications, and they may be doing 10 or 20 deals out of them. So my perception is that simply we have shifted the valley of death, and the question really is whether this is a sustainable attrition or whether we got the kind of funding ratio between early and late wrong.
I think it's a great question in the spirit of are we too positive, but do you want to comment on it?
Well, yeah, I think, again, I would say it's down to quality. I think you're seeing also a lot of drug companies now partnering with venture firms, because the venture firms actually only have enough to fund 10 or 20 of the applications, and by being part of that flow of opportunities, you can also tap into another 10 or 20 potentially. But I think ultimately, volume isn't the answer. Thousands should always be down to quality. Whether you're talking about startups from universities, whether you're talking about ideas within your organization, outside your organization, just because that the old model was thousands of things will give you thousands of drugs, it doesn't, right? 10 good ideas will give you 10 good drugs, not thousands, 10 good ideas and thousands of okay ones. So I think there is, volume shouldn't be for me what we're looking at. It should be the quality of the applications that are coming in, and are they good enough to warrant funding?
Well, if you go to the funding, we have been, and that's a kind of a European phenomena, Europe has been extremely good in turning euros into knowledge, but not very good in turning the knowledge back into euros. Yeah. And that is why also from our side we're going to continue on the one hand to support basic research, or we call it frontier research, to really make sure that new ideas, you know, are being explored. But we're going to put much more funds into innovation-related activities, giving proof of concept, technology validation, bringing things to the market, clinical trials, level 3, 4, we go quite far in that, demonstrators. So we see very clearly that the deployment of the knowledge is the thing where Europe has not been always strong, and there we are going to concentrate much more emphasis on.
Maybe there. Where's the mic? Please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Harsh from University of Edinburgh. So we were talking about the clusters, Oxford, Cambridge and London, which has been tremendously successful in terms of securing funding, the research and starting up businesses. So my question is in two parts really. So the first one is, how do you think we can replicate this success elsewhere? So for example, Edinburgh is investing a lot in startups at the moment, but you don't see as much success up north as you see over here in this cluster. So how do we replicate this success? And the second bit of the question is, if I was to start a biotech company in the future, because all the funding is so focused down south, do you think as an entrepreneur I would be well off setting up a company here compared to up north?
Can I, first of all, I think you have an extraordinary technical and clinical base, and your investment in stem cells is probably preeminent in this country and around the world. So you are specializing, you're doing incredibly well, and if we go up the coast a little bit to Dundee, they've done very well as well. So, you know, these are self-assembling clusters, and we've talked about the Golden Triangle. You go there with the presumption you're going to go find good science. But if you want to go to Edinburgh or Dundee, and you're specialized, you will find excellent science, and you are finding international investment coming your way because of the way that you have brought clinical medicine together with your academic base. So when Wyeth comes in with a $50 million investment, people can learn from what you've done in Scotland with your big data in the way they can't down south. So I have to pummel you back. You're doing well, and I believe you will continue to do well.
Bill, just to push back a little bit though on that, because I think they do well, but they do well. So it's specialised. You're not trying to do everything.
No, they've selected.
You're not trying to do everything well. I think that's the key. Yeah. So, you know, stem cell regenerative medicine in Edinburgh, top notch. You would go and invest there because you've built a core capability that is actually has a critical mass to be successful. Same with the kinase consortium that Professor Cohen built up. But there is something about you know, so if you were to start a biotech company, if it was in stem cells, I'd stay where you were. If it was in some other area of biomedical research that is better represented in the Golden Triangle down here, I'd say move down here, because you're more able to recruit, you're more able to collaborate, you're more able to get funding.
Recruiting is a massive, massive issue. And if you are in somewhere, and we would like to recruit the best talent wherever it comes from. So if they're people in the States, if they're on the continent, or if they're in different regions in the UK, we have to build our companies in those areas where people want to come to. Because if we have to get them to relocate, it's got to be somewhere where they know they're in a productive and vibrant ecosystem. So I would just be cautious about setting up too many biotech companies in remote areas. Not that Edinburgh is remote, but as a thing, I just would be careful because recruiting is a fundamental issue. And in our little companies, we don't have the luxury of being able to train people. So we have to get people who are basically hit the ground running and get on with the development or discovery or whatever it is they're going to do, because we have very limited resources, and you know we've got a very clear goal that we need to achieve, and it's very hard to do that if you don't have a good pool of talent from which to recruit.
Definition of a cluster. With a cluster, you don't have to change home, schools, or wives. And there's a big difference between great science and a cluster. And so when you get a bit older, make sure you move to a cluster.
I'll be a little bit parochial, given that we're moving from the northwest to the south, okay? Because you know, AstraZeneca had a very successful site in Audley Park, and we're moving our R&D headquarters down to Cambridge. And what advantage does that bring to us? So recruiting internationally to Audley Park, whilst possible, was difficult. If I compare it to my ability to hire people into Cambridge, it's proving very easy. So straight away your hit rate in terms of recruiting top talent changes. If I then look at the demographics of my population once they join the company, of how easy do they move away, it's very difficult, right? Because once you're in the Northwest, in Alderley Park, there's no other biotech or pharma company for people to move to. So what that does is, over a period of time, particularly in an environment which is constricting rather than expanding, is it kind of gets you a little bit stagnant because you don't have any turnover in your workforce. And there's nothing worse in a scientific organization than not having some turnover. So that's the reason, I think, why you want to be somewhere where you have an ecosystem around you, because it makes it much easier for you to move about, for people to progress their careers, for you to hire, for you to actually be on top of your game, because if you're not on top of your game, people are going to go and work next door. It just makes it a much more challenging environment to work in, I think, in a positive way.
Well, let's be clear. I mean, we are all here in Cambridge, but Cambridge does not have the monopoly of excellence.
Absolutely not.
There are pockets of excellence all over the place. If you look at Edinburgh, you look at Dundee, if you look at Leiden in the Netherlands, you look at Lund. I mean, it's a lot of these interesting places where a lot is going on. I think it will be a challenge for Cambridge to try to maintain its position as it has now.
So if you didn't realize, this question got the panel excited about entrepreneurship. So I'm getting very visible signs I have to stop now. I'm sorry. I know there are easily 20 more questions, so I'm afraid we have to move it into the lunch break. So I would just use it quickly. A big thank you to this kind of fantastic flow of questions. I mean, if we took a few things here away, I mean, I think from the panel, clearly a lot is happening on the funding side, from basic research all the way to industry. I take Kate on her word, you have to be positive. So certainly there are challenges, but I think you saw now 5 examples from people on various sides here, how they look at it. Entrepreneurship, I think, was a big theme. I mean, this is what gets the panel, I think, quite excited here in the end with your last question there. And I think what we should perhaps realize as a panel, if I look through the 15 questions, there was a lot around, is money only going to the big shots, only to certain universities, and is it all very hard as a young researcher to get to it? So I think there was a lot of commentary how to deal with this problem, but I hope you take something into your working day on Wednesday, so there's perhaps something to discuss about. So with that, I thank all our panelists a lot and the audience for the engaged discussions. Thank you.
Thank you.